The Duke of Ashford had announced his engagement on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, the entire household understood that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. And when the quiet maid who cleaned his study finally stepped forward during the pre-wedding banquet and said in a voice that carried across crystal and gold, "Don't marry her, my lord," every guest in the hall turned to stone. Because servants did not speak at noble gatherings. They certainly did not interrupt them. And they never, ever told the Duke what to do. But Margot Penn had just done all three. 3 weeks earlier, Ashford Manor had received the news with appropriate celebration. Duke Theodore Ashford, 31 and devastatingly alone since his father's death 2 years prior, had finally chosen a bride. Lady Celeste Harrington arrived with impeccable credentials, daughter of an earl, educated in Geneva, fluent in 4 languages, beautiful in the calculated way women of her station were trained to be. The staff prepared guest chambers. Seamstresses arrived daily. The chapel was cleaned until every stone gleamed. And Margot Penn, who had worked in the manor for 18 months, continued doing what she always did. She remained invisible. Her responsibilities were simple: maintain the Duke's private study, manage his correspondence when his secretary was occupied, ensure the library remained organized. She performed each task with quiet precision, arriving before dawn, leaving after dusk, speaking only when necessary. The other servants liked her well enough, but knew almost nothing about her. She was competent, forgettable, and entirely beneath the notice of anyone who mattered. That included the Duke himself. Theodore Ashford was not unkind. He simply existed in a different world, one of ledgers and land management, political dinners, and ancestral duty. He nodded at servants in hallways. He thanked them absently when they refilled his wine. But he did not see them, not really, because his entire life had been constructed around maintaining distance between what he was and what everyone else could never be. Lady Celeste understood that world perfectly. She moved through Ashford Manor like she already owned it, which in 3 weeks she would. Her laughter echoed through corridors during afternoon teas. Her perfume lingered in rooms long after she departed. She spoke to the Duke with practiced charm, to his peers with perfect deference, and to the servants with polite dismissal. Margot watched it all from the corners where invisible people stand. She watched Lady Celeste smile brilliantly at the Duke over breakfast, then snap at a kitchen maid for serving lukewarm tea the moment he left the room. She watched her accept compliments about her charitable work, then laugh cruelly with visiting ladies about a merchant's wife whose gown had been poorly tailored. She watched her rest a gentle hand on the Duke's arm during evening walks, then heard her call the groundskeeper an imbecile when roses were cut incorrectly for her chamber. Most troubling of all, Margot began noticing the letters. As part of her duties, she organized the Duke's correspondence each morning. Most were routine, business matters, invitations, reports from estate managers. But 3 times in 2 weeks, sealed letters arrived addressed to Lady Celeste, bearing a crest Margot eventually identified as belonging to Lord Ashton Vay, a notorious gambler whose estate had nearly bankrupted twice. The letters disappeared into Lady Celeste's possession before anyone else saw them. Margot told herself it meant nothing. Perhaps they were childhood acquaintances. Perhaps it was innocent family business. Perhaps she was imagining shadows where none existed because she disliked the woman's cruelty and wanted reasons to justify the feeling. But then came the afternoon Margot entered the conservatory to retrieve a book the Duke had requested, and found Lady Celeste speaking in low, urgent tones to a man who was decidedly not the Duke. Margot froze behind a column of climbing roses. Said the payments must continue until the wedding, the man was saying. His voice carried the smooth desperation of someone accustomed to needing money. Afterward, you'll have access to everything. And if he discovers the debts before then? Lady Celeste's voice had lost all its musical charm. He won't. You've managed him perfectly so far. Theodore is not a fool, Ashton. If he questions the timeline, then you'll do what you do best. Smile. Convince him it's love. 3 more weeks, and his entire fortune secures both our futures. Silence followed. Then Lady Celeste laughed, cold and bright. I almost pity him. He's so desperately lonely he actually believes I chose him. Margot's hands tightened on the book she carried. She should leave. She should retreat silently and pretend she'd heard nothing, because servants who overheard noble conversations rarely benefited from the knowledge. But something in those words, the casual cruelty, the calculated deception, the idea of the Duke being used so thoroughly by someone he trusted, made her remain completely still until both figures departed. That evening, Margot stood outside the Duke's study for 20 minutes, trying to convince herself to knock. She didn't. Because what could she possibly say? That she'd overheard a private conversation? That a noblewoman's letters seemed suspicious? She was a maid. She had no proof, no standing, no right to make accusations that could destroy reputations. The Duke would never believe her. So Margot returned to her small room in the servants' quarters and told herself that silence was wisdom. But 2 weeks later, standing in a banquet hall filled with crystal and expectation, watching the Duke smile at a woman who intended to ruin him, Margot Pym discovered that some silences were simply cowardice dressed as prudence. And when Lady Celeste raised her glass for a toast, her eyes cold with victory, Margot finally understood what she had to do. The pre-wedding banquet had reached its 4th course when Margot stepped forward from the servants' corridor. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might stop altogether. But her voice emerged steady and clear. "Don't marry her, my lord." The effect was catastrophic. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. 200 eyes turned toward the plain-dressed maid standing impossibly at the center of aristocratic attention, and the silence that followed felt like falling. The Duke stared at her with an expression caught between shock and confusion, as though a piece of furniture had suddenly begun speaking. Beside him, Lady Celeste's face drained of color before flushing with rage. "How dare you?" Lady Celeste's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Remove this woman immediately." But the Duke raised one hand slightly, his gaze still fixed on Margot with something that looked almost like recognition. "Wait." He stood slowly, the movement drawing every eye back to him. When he spoke, his voice carried the controlled courtesy of someone navigating utterly foreign territory. "You work in my household." It wasn't a question, but Margot answered anyway. "Yes, Your Grace. I maintain your study. And you chose this moment, in front of 200 guests, to offer unsolicited commentary on my marriage." The danger in his tone was unmistakable. Margot forced herself to meet his eyes. "I chose this moment because tomorrow would be too late." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Lady Celeste stood abruptly, her chair scraping against marble. "Theodore, this is absurd." "She's clearly disturbed. She's clearly brave." The Duke interrupted quietly, still watching Margot with unreadable intensity. "Foolish, perhaps, but brave." He descended from the raised table, his footsteps echoing in the awful silence, and stopped 3 paces from where Margot stood trembling. "Speak, then. Justify this interruption." Margot's throat felt desert dry. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to retreat, to disappear back into the invisible safety she'd abandoned. But she thought of the Duke's rare, genuine smile when he believed himself alone in his study. She thought of Lady Celeste's cold laughter in the conservatory. She thought of the letters, the debts, the calculated deception. "Your bride is not who you believe her to be," Margot said quietly. Lady Celeste laughed sharply. "This is jealousy, nothing more. A servant who's developed inappropriate feelings." "I overheard a conversation," Margot continued, her voice growing stronger. 3 weeks ago, in the conservatory, Lady Celeste was speaking with Lord Ashton Vey. The name landed like a stone in water. Several guests exchanged knowing glances. Vey's gambling debts were apparently common knowledge among the nobility. Lady Celeste's expression flickered just slightly. "Lord Vey is a distant cousin." Any conversation would have been perfectly innocent. "He mentioned debts," Margot said. "Payments that must continue until the wedding. He said that afterward, she would have access to everything." She looked directly at the Duke. "Your fortune, my lord. That's what she's securing. For both of them." The Duke's face remained carefully blank, but something dangerous had entered his eyes. "These are serious accusations." "They're lies," Lady Celeste snapped, her composure cracking. "Theodore, surely you won't give credence to servants' gossip. Then you deny receiving correspondence from Lord Vey?" Margot interrupted. 3 sealed letters in 2 weeks, bearing his family crest. They arrived with her private mail. I sort the Duke's correspondence each morning." Lady Celeste went very still. The Duke turned slowly toward his intended bride. "Celeste, distant family matters," she said quickly. "Nothing that concerns." Show me the letters. I don't keep. Show me the letters, or I'll send someone to retrieve them from your chambers. The silence stretched impossibly tight. Lady Celeste's mask finally shattered. Completely, replaced by cold fury. You would believe a servant over me? Over your own betrothed? I would believe evidence, the Duke said quietly, which he seemed remarkably reluctant to provide. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Lady Celeste straightened, her expression transforming into something cruel and unmasked. Fine. Yes, Ashton and I have an understanding. Yes, your fortune would have resolved certain financial complications. But don't pretend you're some wounded innocent, Theodore. Her voice dripped with contempt. You're a lonely, desperate man who proposed after 3 supervised visits because you were so pathetically grateful anyone would have you. The Duke flinched as though struck. You wanted someone appropriate, Lady Celeste continued viciously. Someone who would smile correctly at dinners and produce airs and never make you feel anything real. Well, congratulations, you nearly got exactly that. She turned to leave, then paused beside Margot. You've ruined me, you know. This scandal will follow me everywhere. Margot met her gaze steadily. You ruined yourself. Lady Celeste's laugh was ugly. Enjoy your moral victory, girl. I promise it won't feel worth what comes next. She swept from the hall, followed by a handful of shocked relatives. The remaining guests erupted into conversation immediately, the sound swelling like a wave. The Duke stood frozen at the center of it all, his face carefully expressionless. Then he looked at Margot, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not anger, not gratitude, but a kind of raw, unguarded confusion. Come with me, he said quietly. Margot followed him from the banquet hall, through marble corridors, into the private sanctuary of his study. The door closed behind them, muffling the chaos outside. For a long time, neither spoke. Then the Duke crossed to the window overlooking the darkened gardens and pressed both palms against the glass. How did you know? His voice sounded hollowed out. How did you see what I did? Margot remained near the door, still trembling. Because I was paying attention, my lord. While I was merely being lonely and desperate, apparently. You were being human. The words came out softer than intended. That's not weakness. He turned to face her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. You risked everything. Your position, your reputation. What? Margot thought of all the honest answers she could give. Because it was right. Because someone needed to. Because silence is not neutrality when it protects cruelty. Instead, she said simply, because you deserve better. The Duke stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. And perhaps he was. The Duke of Ashford did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his study until dawn, turning over every conversation he'd had with Lady Celeste, searching for the blindness he should have recognized. And more unsettling still, thinking about the quiet maid who had seen through deception he'd missed entirely. When morning arrived, so did chaos. The scandal spread through neighboring estates faster than fire. Lady Celeste's family issued formal statements denouncing both the broken engagement and the servant's slander that caused it. Several noble families withdrew invitations, unwilling to associate with controversy. The Duke's own relatives sent concerned letters questioning his judgment and believing household staff over aristocratic peers. Through it all, Margot continued her duties as though nothing had changed. The Duke found her in the library 3 days after the banquet, shelving books with her usual quiet precision. She startled slightly when she noticed him, dropping into an automatic curtsy. Your Grace. Don't, he said quietly. When she looked up in confusion, he clarified. Don't pretend we're strangers. Not after what you did. Margot straightened carefully. I was simply performing my duty, my lord. Your duty is maintaining my study, not destroying your own future to protect mine. Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or fear of where this conversation led. If you're dismissing me, why would I dismiss you? Because I caused a scandal. Because half your peers now question your judgment. Because keeping me employed suggests you value a servant's word over noble opinion. The Duke studied her for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. It does rather suggest that. Margot's breath caught. He moved closer, his footsteps soft against carpet. I've spent 3 days reviewing household records. Did you know you're fluent in 5 languages? That you've reorganized my entire filing system using a method more efficient than my secretary's? That the groundskeeper mentioned you helped redesign the rose garden last spring, and the head cook says you mediate disputes in the servants' quarters more effectively than anyone in recent memory. Margot's cheeks flushed. I was simply trying to be useful. You were being extraordinary, he corrected quietly. And I never noticed. Because I never looked. The silence between them felt different now, charged with something neither had anticipated. May I ask you something? The Duke said. Why take a position here? You're clearly overqualified for general household work. Margot hesitated, then seemed to decide truth had already cost her everything anyway. My father was a tutor. He taught me languages, literature, philosophy. When he died, I had education but no prospects. Women like me don't become governesses without references. We become maids, if we're fortunate. And you never resented it. I resented invisibility, she admitted. But the work itself? No. There's dignity in doing anything well. The Duke felt something shift in his chest, not attraction alone, though he could no longer pretend that wasn't present. Something deeper. Recognition. Of competence where he'd assumed simplicity. Of strength where he'd seen only service. I need to ask you something else, he said carefully. And I need you to answer honestly, regardless of what you think I want to hear. Margot met his gaze. Of course, my lord. Do you think I'm capable of better judgment than I demonstrated with Lady Celeste? She didn't answer immediately, and he respected her more for the consideration. I think you're capable of seeing people clearly when you choose to look, she said finally. You simply haven't had much practice lately. Help me practice. Margot blinked. My lord, I'm not proposing, he added quickly, seeing her alarm. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate. I'm simply asking if you would consider a different position. Not as a maid. As an advisor. Advisors are noblemen. Advisors are people I trust to tell me uncomfortable truths. After recent events, you seem uniquely qualified. Margot stared at him in disbelief. Your peers would be scandalized. My peers were perfectly content to let me marry a woman planning to rob me blind. Their opinions suddenly carry less weight. A smile tugged at Margot's lips despite herself. You're serious. Completely. Though I warn you, the position would require attending social functions, managing correspondence, likely learning estate management. The work would be considerably more demanding than your current duties. And considerably more visible. Yes, he acknowledged. You would no longer be invisible. People would notice you, question you, possibly resent you. It would not be easy. Margot looked around the library, at the books she'd organized, the space she'd maintained, the invisible work she'd performed for 18 months. Then she looked back at the Duke, at the man she'd risked everything to protect, and felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope. When would I start? She asked quietly. The Duke's expression transformed into something that looked remarkably like relief. Immediately, if you're willing. I have a dinner with county magistrates next week, and I strongly suspect I'll need someone to tell me when I'm being an idiot. That seems likely, Margot agreed, then immediately looked horrified. I'm sorry, that was perfect, he interrupted, laughing properly for the first time in days. That was perfect. 6 months later, the Duke of Ashford hosted a spring gathering that became legendary for 2 reasons. First, because his new senior advisor, a former maid named Margot Penn, gave a speech about estate management reform that left half the nobles speechless and the other half frantically taking notes. And second, because at the end of the evening, the Duke himself took the unprecedented step of publicly thanking her, not as an employee, but as the person who had saved him from making the greatest mistake of his life. The scandal never fully disappeared. Society loved its hierarchies too much for that. But something about the Duke's unwavering respect for Margot's competence gradually shifted the conversation. If the Duke of Ashford valued capability over pedigree, perhaps there was wisdom in the choice. And perhaps, several sharp-eyed observers noted, there was something else in how he looked at her now, not across an impossible distance, but as though seeing clearly for the very first time. 2 years later, on a quiet morning in the same study where everything had changed, Theodore knelt before Margot not as a duke before a subject, but as a man before the woman who had shown him what true worth looked like. When he asked her to marry him, Margot laughed and cried and said yes. And the falcon, the estate's hunting bird that had once refused everyone's handling except the Duke's, landed contentedly on her arm during the wedding celebration, as though it had always known what the rest of them took far too long to see. that nature recognized what society ignored, that loyalty answered to character, not title, and that the most extraordinary people were often the ones everyone had trained themselves not to see, until someone finally chose to look.